Rachel Thompson stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror of her childhood bedroom, barely recognizing the worn-out woman looking back at her. At 35, she felt like she'd lived a lifetime already, each line on her face a testament to the struggles she'd endured. As she absently twisted a strand of her mousy brown hair, memories flooded back unbidden. She saw herself as a bright-eyed teenager, full of dreams and determination, boarding a bus to the big city. "I'll make it, Mama," she'd promised her teary-eyed mother. "You'll see. I'll have it all." For a while, it seemed like she would. Rachel remembered the pride she'd felt landing her first job at the Sunshine Textiles factory, the butterflies in her stomach when Tom, the handsome foreman, had asked her out. Their whirlwind romance had been the talk of the factory floor. "You're the one, Rach," Tom had whispered on their wedding night, his eyes shining with love and promise. "We're gonna have it all, baby. The house, the picket fence, the whole 9 yards." Rachel's hand instinctively went to her stomach as she recalled the joy of discovering she was pregnant. Sophie had been perfect, a little angel with Tom's blue eyes and Rachel's dimpled smile. But life had a way of pulling the rug out from under you when you least expected it. The accident played out in Rachel's mind like a horror movie she couldn't turn off. 7-year-old Sophie, wobbling on her new bike, the sickening crunch as she hit the curb, the endless hours in the hospital waiting room. "She'll need extensive therapy," the doctors had said. "It's going to be a long road." Rachel had turned to Tom, expecting to see the same determination she felt. Instead, she saw fear in something else: defeat. The medical bills piled up, their savings dwindled, and Tom started staying out later and later. Rachel could still smell the whiskey on his breath the night he told her he was leaving. "I can't do this anymore, Rach," he'd slurred, not meeting her eyes. "I'm not cut out for this. You and Sophie? You're better off without me." Rachel had woken the next morning to find his side of the closet empty and a hastily scribbled note on the kitchen table. Just like that, her dream of having it all had shattered into a million pieces. Now, as she looked around the faded floral wallpaper of her girlhood room, Rachel felt a familiar ache in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She wasn't supposed to be back in Oakdale, population 2,000, living in her parents' old house with her disabled daughter. "Mama?" Sophie's voice called from the next room. "Are you up?" Rachel took a deep breath, plastered on a smile, and called back. "Coming, sweetie. Ready for breakfast?" As she helped Sophie into her wheelchair, Rachel silently vowed to do whatever it took to give her daughter the life she deserved, even if it meant swallowing her pride and starting over in the very place she'd once been so desperate to escape. The early morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Rachel made her way to Oakdale's only grocery store. The air was thick with the scent of fresh cut hay and the distant lowing of cattle smells that had once made Rachel wrinkle her nose in disgust, but now brought a strange comfort. She'd been back in Oakdale for nearly 4 years now, working at the newly established Green Pastures dairy farm. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills and allowed her to be home in time to care for Sophie. As Rachel approached Miller's General Store, she caught sight of her neighbor, Betty Johnson, hovering by the entrance. Betty's eyes lit up at the sight of Rachel, and she waved enthusiastically. "Rachel, honey, just the person I wanted to see," Betty called out, her voice carrying down the quiet street. Rachel suppressed a sigh. Betty was a sweet woman, but she was also Oakdale's most notorious gossip. Still, Rachel plastered on a smile as she approached. "Morning, Betty. How are you?" Betty leaned in conspiratorially, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "Oh, I'm just fine, dear. But listen, have you heard about the newcomer?" Rachel's brow furrowed. "Newcomer? Yes, Betty nodded vigorously. "Someone's moved into old Mrs. Smith's place, you know, that run-down cabin near the woods?" Rachel vaguely remembered the dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, as far as she knew. "I saw him yesterday," Betty continued, lowering her voice. "Tall, dark, and oh my, those eyes, black as coal they were. Didn't say a word to anyone, just stared straight ahead like he was seeing ghosts." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine despite the warm morning. "Did anyone talk to him? Find out who he is?" Betty shook her head. "That's just it. He's a complete mystery. Some folks are saying he might be Mrs. Smith's long-lost grandson, but I don't know. There's something different about him. As Betty continued to speculate, Rachel found her mind wandering. A mysterious stranger in Oakdale? It was the most exciting thing to happen in years. Part of her, the part that still dreamed of adventure, was intrigued, but the protective mother in her felt uneasy. "Well, I'm sure we'll find out soon enough," Rachel said, gently cutting off Betty's rambling. "This is Oakdale, after all. Nothing stays secret for long." Betty chuckled. "Ain't that the truth? Oh, before I forget, could you be a dear and grab me a pack of salt while you're in there? My arthritis is acting up something fierce today." Rachel nodded, heading into the store. As she browsed the aisles, she could hear the other customers buzzing about the mysterious newcomer. Theories ranged from him being a reclusive millionaire to an escaped convict in hiding. By the time Rachel left the store, her head was spinning with all the gossip. She couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and apprehension. Change was coming to Oakdale, and Rachel wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Rachel's arms were laden with groceries as she rounded the corner to her house. The old Thompson family home wasn't much to look at these days. The paint was peeling, and the porch sagged a bit, but it was home. As she approached, a flash of movement in the backyard caught her eye. Rachel's heart leapt into her throat when she realized it was Sophie, out of the house and in her wheelchair. But Sophie wasn't alone. A tall figure stood next to her daughter's wheelchair, his back to Rachel. Even from this distance, she could see his broad shoulders and dark hair, the mysterious newcomer. Rachel dropped her grocery bags, barely registering the sound of breaking eggs as she rushed towards them. "Sophie," she called out, her voice sharp with fear and anger. "Sophie, come inside right now." The man turned, and Rachel felt her breath catch. Betty hadn't been exaggerating about his eyes. They were dark, intense, and seemed to look right through her. Sophie looked up, her face lighting up at the sight of her mother. "Mom, come meet Mr. Nathan. He's our new neighbor, and he knows all about—" "Inside, Sophie. Now." Rachel cut her off, her voice leaving no room for argument. The man, Nathan, took a step back, raising his hand slightly, as if to show he meant no harm. "I apologize if I've overstepped. I was just—" "Thank you," Rachel interrupted coolly. "But I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak to my daughter without me present in the future." Nathan nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Of course, I understand. Have a good day, Miss Thompson," Rachel replied stiffly. "Goodbye, Mr. Nathan." As Nathan walked away, Rachel quickly ushered Sophie inside, her heart still racing. "Mom, why were you so mean?" Sophie asked, her lower lip trembling slightly. "Mr. Nathan was really nice. He was telling me about different exercises I could try to strengthen my legs." Rachel knelt in front of Sophie's wheelchair, taking her daughter's hands in hers. "Sweetie, I know you meant well, but we don't know anything about this man. It's not safe to talk to strangers, especially when I'm not around. Promise me you won't do it again." Sophie nodded reluctantly. "I promise. But Mom, I think Mr. Nathan could help me. He said he used to be a doctor." Rachel felt a flutter of hope in her chest, quickly squashed by suspicion. Why would a doctor move to a place like Oakdale and not tell anyone about his profession? "Let's not worry about Mr. Nathan right now," Rachel said, forcing a smile. "How about we make some lunch?" As she prepared sandwiches, Rachel couldn't shake the image of Nathan's intense gaze from her mind. There was something about him, something that both intrigued and unsettled her. She had a feeling this wouldn't be the last she'd see of their mysterious new neighbor. 2 weeks had passed since the encounter with Nathan, and life in the Thompson household had settled back into its usual routine. Rachel spent her days at the dairy farm, coming home each evening to help Sophie with her homework and physical therapy exercises. But there was a subtle shift in the air, a tension Rachel couldn't quite put her finger on. She had caught Sophie staring out the window more often, a wistful expression on her face. And more than once, Rachel could have sworn she saw a tall, dark figure at the edge of their property, always disappearing before she could get a good look. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Rachel noticed the book. Sophie was curled up on the couch, deeply engrossed in a hardcover volume Rachel didn't recognize. "What are you reading there, sweetie?" Rachel asked, peering over her daughter's shoulder. Sophie startled slightly, then held up the book. "It's called Conquering Yourself, Mom. It's really interesting." Rachel frowned, taking the book from Sophie's hands. Where did you get this? I don't remember buying it for you." Sophie's cheeks flushed and she looked down at her lap. "Mr. Nathan gave it to me," she admitted quietly. "He said it might help me stay motivated with my exercises." Rachel felt a flash of anger. "Sophie, what did I tell you about talking to him?" "I didn't," Sophie protested. "He left it on our porch with a note." "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have told you, but I was afraid you'd take it away." Rachel sighed, flipping through the pages of the book. It seemed to be a collection of inspirational stories about people overcoming physical challenges. Despite her reservations, she had to admit it seemed like something that could benefit Sophie. "All right," Rachel said slowly. "You can keep the book, but Sophie, please, if Mr. Nathan tries to contact you again, you have to tell me." "Promise?" Sophie nodded eagerly. "I promise, Mom. Thank you." As Sophie returned to her reading, Rachel found herself staring out the window towards Nathan's property. Part of her wanted to march over there and give him a piece of her mind for going behind her back, but another part, a part she was trying hard to ignore, was curious. Why was this man so interested in helping Sophie? Rachel shook her head, pushing the thoughts away. She had enough to worry about without adding a mysterious neighbor to the mix. Still, as she went about her chores that afternoon, she couldn't help but wonder what other surprises Nathan might have in store for them. The Green Pastures dairy farm was bustling with activity. Rachel moved among the cows with practiced ease, her mind only half on her work as she thought about Sophie. Her daughter had been in higher spirits lately, throwing herself into her exercises with newfound determination. Rachel couldn't help but wonder if it had something to do with that book, and by extension, with Nathan. "Rachel, Rachel," the panicked voice cut through her thoughts. Rachel turned to see Betty running towards her, face flushed and eyes wide with fear. "Betty? What's wrong?" Rachel asked, her heart immediately racing. Betty grabbed Rachel's arm, gasping for breath. "It's Sophie. That man, he's taken her to his sauna." Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. "What? What man? What are you talking about?" "The newcomer, Nathan," Betty exclaimed. "I saw him wheeling Sophie into that old building behind his house." "Rachel, you have to hurry." Without another word, Rachel took off running. Her mind was a whirlwind of terrifying possibilities. How could she have been so stupid? She should never have let Sophie keep that book. She should have trusted her instincts about Nathan from the beginning. As she raced down Main Street, Rachel became aware of footsteps behind her. She glanced back to see several of her co-workers following, some wielding pitchforks and shovels. "We're with you, Rachel," one of them called out. "We'll teach that creep a lesson." Under different circumstances, Rachel might have been touched by the show of support. But right now, all she could think about was getting to Sophie. As they approached Nathan's property, Rachel could see the small, weathered building Betty had mentioned. Without hesitation, she charged towards it, her heart pounding in her ears. "Sophie," she screamed, reaching for the door. "Sophie, I'm coming!" Rachel burst through the door of the sauna, ready for the worst. What she saw instead stopped her in her tracks. The interior of the building had been completely transformed. Gone were the old benches and steam rocks. In their place was a state-of-the-art physical therapy setup, and there, suspended in a complex harness system, was Sophie. "Mom?" Sophie's voice was filled with confusion and a hint of excitement. "Mom, look, I'm standing." Rachel's eyes darted between her daughter and Nathan, who stood nearby, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Miss Thompson," he said calmly, "I can explain everything." Before Rachel could respond, the group of villagers crowded in behind her, their makeshift weapons at the ready. "What in the world?" one of them muttered, taking in the scene. Nathan cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should all take a deep breath and talk about this rationally." Rachel found her voice at last. "Talk? You took my daughter without my permission. What is all this?" Sophie spoke up, her voice eager. "Mom, Mr. Nathan's been helping me with special exercises. Look, I can move my legs more than before." As if to demonstrate, Sophie slowly lifted her leg, the weight attached to the harness rising with it. Rachel watched in astonishment, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. Nathan stepped forward cautiously. "Miss Thompson, I'm a former physician specializing in physical rehabilitation. When I met Sophie, I recognized her condition and knew I could help. I should have spoken to you first, and for that, I deeply apologize." Rachel's mind was reeling. She looked at Sophie, saw the hope shining in her daughter's eyes, then back at Nathan. His gaze was steady, filled with genuine remorse and something else, a deep, lingering sadness. The villagers behind her began to shuffle uncomfortably, lowering their improvised weapons. "Well," Betty's voice broke the silence. "Don't I feel like a fool? All this fuss over a bit of physical therapy?" There was a murmur of agreement, and slowly the crowd began to disperse, offering awkward apologies as they left. Rachel moved to Sophie, helping her out of the harness. "Are you okay, sweetie?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "I'm great, Mom. Can we come back tomorrow, please?" Rachel looked at Nathan, who was watching them with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "I think," Rachel said slowly, "that Mr. Nathan and I need to have a long talk first." That evening, after Sophie had been put to bed, Rachel sat across from Nathan at her kitchen table. The air between them was thick with unspoken questions and lingering tension. Nathan cleared his throat. "Again, Miss Thompson, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding today. It was never my intention to cause any alarm." Rachel nodded stiffly. "I appreciate that, but I think you owe me an explanation. Why all the secrecy? Why didn't you just come to me about helping Sophie from the beginning?" Nathan's gaze dropped to his clasped hands on the table. When he looked up again, his eyes were filled with a pain so raw it took Rachel's breath away. 5 years ago, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had a life not unlike yours. A successful career as a doctor, a beautiful wife, and a daughter. Her name was Lily." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine at the use of past tense. "Was?" Nathan nodded, swallowing hard. "Lily was involved in an accident when she was 9. Her injuries, they were similar to Sophie's." He paused, taking a shaky breath. "I was determined to help her. I'd always been interested in alternative therapies, yoga, anything that might complement traditional medicine. I developed a treatment plan, convinced it would help Lily walk again." Rachel leaned forward, captivated by Nathan's story despite herself. "What happened? My wife? She didn't believe in my methods. She wanted to pursue more aggressive treatments, surgeries." Nathan's voice cracked. "We argued. She took Lily to a specialist overseas. I begged her not to, told her Lily's heart wasn't strong enough for another operation, but she wouldn't listen." A tear slid down Nathan's cheek, and Rachel found herself fighting the urge to reach out and comfort him. "Lily didn't survive the surgery," Nathan said, his voice hollow. "My wife never came back. I couldn't bear to see her, knowing she'd—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I'm so sorry," Rachel whispered, her own eyes filling with tears. Nathan looked up, meeting her gaze. "When I saw Sophie, it was like seeing Lily all over again. I knew I could help, but I was afraid. Afraid of getting close, afraid of failing again. That's why I didn't approach you directly. I thought if I could just show you the progress." Rachel sat back, her mind reeling. Everything made sense now. Nathan's reclusiveness, his immediate connection with Sophie, the pain she'd sensed behind his eyes. "I understand why you did what you did," Rachel said slowly. "But you have to understand my position. Sophie is all I have in this world. The thought of anything happening to her—" Nathan nodded vigorously. "Of course, you're absolutely right. I should have been up front from the beginning." He hesitated, then added, "If you want me to stop the treatments, I'll respect your decision. But I truly believe I can help Sophie improve her mobility, maybe even walk again someday." Rachel studied Nathan's face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. She thought of Sophie's excitement earlier that day, the determination she'd shown lately. "I don't want you to stop," Rachel said finally. "But from now on, everything happens with my knowledge and approval. No more secrets. Deal?" Nathan's relief was palpable. "Deal. Thank you, Miss Thompson. I promise you won't regret this." As Nathan stood to leave, Rachel found herself saying, "It's Rachel. You can call me Rachel." He smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his entire face. "Good night, Rachel. I'll see you tomorrow." After Nathan left, Rachel sat at the table for a long time, thinking about everything she'd learned. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of hope for Sophie's future, and maybe, just maybe, for her own as well. 3 months passed Danae and Nathan. Rachel found herself looking forward to their daily interactions, appreciating Nathan's gentle encouragement with Sophie and his quiet strength. On the morning of Rachel's 36th birthday, she woke to the sound of hushed giggles and the smell of slightly burnt toast. She smiled, pretending to be asleep, as Sophie wheeled into the room, Nathan following close behind with a "Happy birthday, Mom!" Sophie exclaimed, unable to contain her excitement any longer. Rachel sat up, feigning surprise. "Oh my goodness, what's all this?" Nathan set the tray on her lap, a slightly sheepish grin on his face. "Breakfast in bed, courtesy of Chef Sophie. I just supervised and maybe rescued the toast." Rachel laughed, her heart full as she looked at her daughter's beaming face and Nathan's warm smile. "It's perfect, thank you both." As they shared the breakfast, Sophie could barely sit still. "Mom, I have a special birthday present for you. Can we go to the therapy room after breakfast?" Rachel raised an eyebrow at Nathan, who simply shrugged mysteriously. "All right, sweetie, I can't wait to see it." An hour later, they gathered in Nathan's converted sauna. Sophie sat in her wheelchair, practically vibrating with excitement. "Ready, Mom?" she asked, gripping the arms of her chair. Rachel nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. "Ready, baby?" Slowly, carefully, Sophie pushed herself to her feet. Rachel gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. With determined concentration, Sophie took one shaky step forward, then another. "Oh my God!" Rachel breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Sophie, you're walking?" Sophie managed 3 more steps before her legs began to tremble. Nathan quickly moved to support her, helping her back to the wheelchair. But the triumph in Sophie's eyes was unmistakable. "Happy birthday, Mom," she said, her own eyes shining with tears. Rachel enveloped her daughter in a fierce hug, then turned to Nathan. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him too. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much." As they embraced, a voice from the doorway startled them. "Well, it's about time." They turned to see Betty standing there, a knowing smile on her face. "The whole town's been waiting for you two to wise up and get together." Rachel felt her face flush as she stepped back from Nathan. "Betty, it's not. We're not." But as she looked at Nathan, saw the warmth and affection in his eyes, Rachel realized maybe Betty wasn't so far off the mark. "Now, don't you go denying it," Betty continued, wagging a finger at them. "I've seen the way you two look at each other." "Why, if I were 20 years younger?" "Betty," Rachel exclaimed, laughing despite her embarrassment. Sophie giggled. "Does this mean Nathan's going to be my new dad? Ooh, can I be the flower girl at your wedding?" "Sophie!" Rachel and Nathan spoke in unison, then looked at each other and burst out laughing. Betty nodded approvingly. "Well, I'll leave you to it, but don't take too long, you hear? Life's too short to waste time when you've found something good." As Betty left, a comfortable silence fell over the room. Finally, Nathan cleared his throat. "You know," he said softly, "Betty might have a point." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "Oh?" Nathan took her hand, his touch sending a warmth through her entire body. "Rachel, I never thought I'd feel this way again after Lily. But you and Sophie, you've brought light back into my life. I don't want to waste any more time." Rachel felt tears welling up again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I feel the same way," she whispered. As they leaned in for a kiss, Sophie let out a whoop of delight. "Best birthday present ever, Mom." Rachel laughed, pulling back to include her daughter in a group hug. As she stood there, surrounded by the 2 people who meant everything to her, Rachel realized that sometimes life's greatest blessings come in the most unexpected packages. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Nathan turned to Rachel. "You know, I was thinking, maybe it's time I started practicing medicine again. This town could use a good doctor." Rachel smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I think that's a wonderful idea. Oakdale won't know what hit it." "Neither did I," Nathan said softly, kissing the top of her head. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Rachel thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain, the struggles, the unexpected twists of fate, all of it had led her here, to a place of love, hope, and new beginnings.